right, let's jump in. We have three new experts on the stage that I'd love to introduce very quickly. So sitting next to me is Ambassador John Herbst. He is the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a former US Ambassador to Ukraine. Sitting next to him is Dr. Nicole Goldin, Non-Resident Senior Fellow with the Atlantic Council's GeoEconomics Center and Global Head Inclusive Economic Growth at ABT Associates, and a former Senior Advisor at the State Department, USAID, and the World Bank. And sitting next to Nicole is Landon Derentz, the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center and a former Director for Energy at the White House. So it's great to be with all of you. Last panel was a little more focused on different regions of the world. Ambassador Herbst focuses on a region. He's the head of the Eurasia Center, but one of the biggest issues they focus on Ukraine is obviously a very cross-cutting issue. And we have an economic perspective, an energy perspective. We're going to dive into all of that right now. Ambassador Herbst, I want to start with you. So much to think about with the global consequences of the war in Ukraine and beyond. What is the top risk you're paying attention to most in the year ahead?
I would reformulate the question.
Okay, go for it.
The top risk in the world today is a revisionist Kremlin willing to use war to change the global order. If this risk is properly understood, then there's really not a debate in the United States about providing philanthropic assistance on a massive scale to an obscure country in Eastern Europe. The question is, how does America protect its security? How does America defend its prosperity? And the answer to that is we make sure that Putin's aggression in Ukraine fails. This is not a war in Ukraine. This is an errant grab by a nuclear superpower to destroy another nation. And it is very much in our interests, vital to us, that he fail, that Putin fail.
Do you think that failure could happen in 2024?
No. I think that failure is unlikely to happen. Put another way, as long as strong Western support for Ukraine continues, Putin will lose. And if you pay close attention to statements coming out of the Kremlin and analyses, even by those who don't have the wit to see the danger to Western interests of a Russian victory, they talk all the time about Putin's confidence that the West will get tired of this war. And again, if we think this is an obscure war, thousands of miles from our shores, which have no impact on our security and our prosperity, that's true. But Putin has not hidden, his senior minions have not hidden their intention to go farther west if they win in Ukraine. So it's very much in our interest to give Ukraine everything it needs to ensure that doesn't happen. And the 34 or 40 billion a year we've given 2 years in a row, economic and military aid, by the way, Europe gives more than we do, so don't fall for that, represents approximately 3% of our defense budget. For that, the Ukrainians are destroying every year roughly 50% of Moscow's conventional military capability. A very good investment in American security. And I just keep hoping that President Biden says it in that way, that clearly, to the American public. He did a good job this morning at the UN, but he did not make this point, which will have resonance in the United States.
Okay. Well, I want to come back to you on an opportunity you see ahead in the coming year. But Nicole, I'm wondering if I can go to you next. What is a risk you're watching in the year ahead in your space?
Sure, thanks so much. So it's great to be with all of you. One of the main things that I'm watching in the geoeconomic space picks up a little on what we heard from our colleagues earlier in terms of geopolitical and geoeconomic fragmentation. And in particular, what we're seeing and what I'm watching is what that means for de-investment and to some degree capital flight away from the emerging market and developing economies that had been growing rather quickly and contribute obviously so much to sort of global growth as well as stability. So what we're seeing is high risk continuing in these regions driven by persistent inflation. debt distress, which is a kind of related top risk in and of itself, and particularly in the global south. The average debt right now, sovereign debt, averages 60% of GDP in the EMDEs, the emerging market and developing economies. And so what that means is that risk combined with conflict risk, climate risk, is meaning, and this geopolitical realignment and fragmentation means that we're seeing a decline in investment. We're seeing a decline and reallocation, if you will, of FDI. And what that means then is you have less investment, you have less output, you have less productivity, and it's creating that circle that IMF researchers estimate could amount to 2% loss of GDP globally, which is actually pretty significant on a relatively short-term basis. So that's what I'm watching, and it's got lots of implications, but we'll get to opportunities. I like to be glass half full as well.
Okay, I get that. I don't know why I always start with risks. I obviously need to be more optimistic, so I'll work on that next time. Landon, over to you. What's the top risk you're watching?
Yuri, I think, well, first of all, thanks for pulling this panel together. And I love that John points out that we often weight our risks. So, some of these, I'm trying to take a very comprehensive view on this. A lot of continuity with what Nicole just said, because ultimately, energy is an underpin for the economy. We've seen a lot of attention in the context of inflation and inflationary pressures affiliated with oil prices typically, but the energy system writ large, which also reverberates into economic security and tangible security. But it's not happenstance that the UN General Assembly coincides with New York Climate Week. Climate change is an overlay to all of this conversation. Climate change is a global ill that requires a multilateral global solution. So when I think about risk, and something that really came tangibly vivid during COP27, the climate conference a year ago, was this increasing global north-south divide. And I think, from an energy context, Russia, Ukraine, and this can go back to John's conversations, obviously have reverberated throughout a need and refocus on energy security. But there's some challenges and tension that does with countries that haven't had an opportunity to mature at the same scale as the transatlantic partners have. And so what you're witnessing, I think, is a risk of deterioration in multilateralism, BRICS versus G7, and a more myopic perspective, the IEA versus OPEC, and these institutions that really need to be working on all cylinders to drive towards solutions are now becoming a little weighted down by the politics of the transition and the ardent level of policy and how we have to address climate, whether it's coming from Brussels or Washington or Riyadh, Beijing, elsewhere.
Do you think there's one of the notes I got from the last panel was that if the U.S. could be more adaptable and engage more, it could mitigate some of these risks. Do you think there is a way that the U.S. can try to, what can U.S. policymakers do to try to avoid the risk you have in mind?
I think there has to be an acknowledgement that the energy transition, which is ultimately a consequence of climate change, that we're looking at reworking our economic models and economic systems to accommodate a future that limits global warming. Ultimately, I think we have to make this a very personal conversation about the lives and livelihoods of individuals, about jobs, about the economic base that's going to allow people to set the conditions for that change. So there needs to be, if not empathy, certainly sympathy within the policymaking apparatus. And this is going to tie to my opportunity, which I assume you want to hear about.
Go on.
When I think about policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, they are an opportunity. They are driving new business models. They're creating incentives for a decarbonization industry. They are bringing capital into markets, but it's being concentrated in transatlantic capitals. It's going to bring wealth back to new energy systems, once again back to the United States, once again back to Europe. Europe a little bit out of necessity as it weans itself from Russia. And I think we have to be realistic about that approach and identify how that energy system, which it really pushes us, it's much more multifaceted than just a fungible oil economy, right? So you have to go dive deep into economies that have the resources and the bandwidth, and you know, Jason spoke of lithium. The countries that have those resources and build up a real inclusive model. And I think that really begins at COP28. If Dr. Sultan was here, I think he would tell you that there's a unique value proposition from a country that is a Middle East oil producer, but also a renewable energy producer, a nuclear energy producer. And I think we need to take an approach that does build in that inclusivity and provides a trajectory for economic growth for everybody. And if we can kind of build that into our foreign policy, our development, extend our development policy outside of just the typical you know, vertical, we can have a lot more impact with the ambitions we have for the energy transition.
Got it. Okay. Nicole, what's an opportunity that's on your mind that you're looking out for in the coming year?
Well, we didn't plan this, but Landon teed it up to some degree. So my opportunity is based on the fact, it's in the short term, it's based on the fact that women's economic opportunity and participation sort of globally is the opportunity, right? Right now, globally, women's average labor force participation is about 50% compared to men's, where it's 80%. So this is a long term, but I do believe in the near term there is an opportunity for marginal improvement, which can actually make quite a significant difference, not only in individuals' lives, in their families, and in their communities, but when you aggregate that, you know, nationally and globally. So again, if you take, for example, South Asia, Middle East, North Africa, where women's labor force participation, economic participation is less than 25% on average. Again, when you see that change, it can make a big difference. And why do I think that there's room for potential change even within the next year? When you look at, take even the US, for example, where in the last few months, women have rebounded back faster than many expected in terms of having been pushed out of the labor force to a large degree during the pandemic, and are seeing record rates of labor force participation in the US. We're seeing things like policies and investments that are being made and starting to take root, whether that's a recognition and more investments in care, which will open up opportunities for women worldwide to engage in paid work, or more work if they're already in the paid labor force. So that's major, and we're seeing that in the public and private sector. We're seeing it tied, for example, in the US to the CHIPS Act, right? And that incentive that was for companies to invest and provide child care. So I think there's examples of some of these investments. The World Bank has made a major investment. The US government through USAID has contributed to their child care facility. And I think we will start to see some of the gains from these kinds of investments and policies in the nearer term that will allow, again, for a marginal but still relevant increase. And the other pieces, again, picking up on Landon, the opportunities in the green economy, when we think about the transition, when we think about the way that women are starting to engage in, you know, worldwide in what's often considered non-traditional workforce, the demand in some of these sectors, whether they are green, whether it's getting back into the demand for care work, as well as providing care, education, and other sectors where women have been either dominant or have been at least able to accelerate. So I think it's a marginal but real opportunity in the short term, and a tremendous opportunity for sort of economic growth and economic output in the longer term.
And do you see that as a big opportunity beyond the United States? You mentioned a number of US examples. Do you see that more globally? Do you feel like it's uneven in terms of the opportunity there around the world at this point?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it is, it's in, like I said, in some ways there's a broader, bigger opportunity in other regions where the current gap between men's and women's labor force participation or economic participation, whether that's in a small business, whether that's even in income generating farming, right, and agriculture, which is critically important for women around the world and contribute to food security. So the opportunity is bigger because the gaps are already starting from a sort of lower point. That being said, I think it will be a slower, a slower pace. Because I'm talking on the opportunistic note, I won't go into the World Economic Forum, that it's going to take us still 132 years to get to parity, gender parity. And there are still pay equity gaps and lots of things. So I do think the opportunity is there globally. I think it might be a slower path. And will require sort of, some different sets of policies. And it relates to all of the other things we've been talking about in terms of, what Ambassador Yada was talking about and the opportunities in Africa. There's huge opportunities for African women, obviously, in particular. And when we think about just some of the other opportunities. And the other thing, the last thing I'd say on that is, I think, again, when we think about women's economic participation and how some of these different policies and opportunities arise, it is different when we think about the investments being made in human capital that really provides an opportunity for young women and young people. But there was a lot of conversations in the U.S. and in a lot of the advanced economies about reskilling and upskilling and better tapping and enabling women that want to work late into in their later years to be able to do so, and investing in their health and ability to do so. So. Long-winded answer to a short question.
No, and also, the World Economic Forum reality check is a good one, because what we try to do with these risks and opportunities, you want to be realistic. We don't want to think about risks and opportunities that are unlikely to occur, and in each opportunity, we have to be realistic about the probability that it will materialize. And again, part of this is an exercise in agency. If we know something is low probability, is there a way to move the needle to make it a higher probability through policy? So it's very helpful to keep in mind.
Finance.
Yeah, exactly. Landon, one just quick follow-up question for you, and then I want to go to Ambassador Herbst. Do you think there's been a shift in the opportunities of the green economy that's happened? Have we reached a tipping point where people are, maybe they were skeptical that the economic opportunities were there, but now there is I know it's hard to generalize, but do you feel that something has occurred in recent years that we'll see accelerate in 2024 in terms of people seeing the economic opportunity in the energy transition?
For the last real 10, 15 years, you've seen a transformation just in the cost of technology and deployment.
Yeah.
And that's leading to a natural transition within the mindsets of definitely consumers in America. How that transitions, regional norms have a huge impact on this.
Yeah.
Europeans are much more incentivized by the regulatory frameworks, and efficiency rules and laws actually really resonate there.
Yeah.
The adoption of smart meters and technology to integrate those systems is perceived as a benefit, not necessarily a violation of privacy. So I think we still have a way to go, but that's a luxury in many ways to developed economies. Yeah. And so I think if you talk to the vast majority of the rest of the world, where you're looking at population growth, where you're looking at economic growth, where you're looking at energy growth, maybe it's not as well adopted as we'd like to believe it is. And really what's going to ultimately resonate there are two things: lowering the cost of the technology for deployment so it outcompetes other conventional means, or financing the gap. And so that's really it's that simple. I don't want to overcomplicate it. Yeah. But we don't, in particular in the United States, have a great track record of putting the capital behind that development of those energy systems, those alternative energy systems. And so I'm a little bit maybe on the bear side on that, yeah. But there is transformation in the energy transition. So I'm very optimistic about it overall. We have a great history of technology and innovation. I think that we're on the cusp of a new industrial base, and some of the policies of the IRA are going to create incentives for a hydrogen economy, for example. But we have a ways to go, I think, for a global adoption.
Got it.
Just super quickly, closing the digital gender gap is also going to be critical to closing the economic gap as well.
Ambassador Herbst, what is the opportunity you see ahead in the coming year?
I hate to be a buzzkill, but I can't finger for 2024 an opportunity that will be realized in 2024. Now, having said that, there are opportunities on the horizon. For example, both Ukraine and Moldova are starting accession talks to the EU. That's a very positive development. And over time, and time might be 2 years, they might be 5, we will see both of those countries enter the EU. I suspect it will be expedited if Putin's little adventure in Ukraine were to collapse next year, which could happen, by the way. That's not to say it will, but it could happen. So that's one thing, or two things. Also, there's a nasty little military operation begun today in Nagorno-Karabakh, a province in Azerbaijan, which has a large Armenian ethnic majority. And this is part of an increasingly provocative Azerbaijan policy going back to them winning the war in 2020 against Armenia. Now, that's a nasty fact that I just put on the table, but it is true that over the past year plus, the United States has been relatively active trying to mediate the differences between Azerbaijan and Armenia. I'm not predicting that the nastiness that has been put out today is going to prompt a much more energetic American policy, but it might. And were that to happen, an energetic, creative, and strong American policy, and of course I'm asking for a lot, could she achieve a real breakthrough? Because there are certainly opportunities, in my judgment, to move Turkey in the right direction on this for a whole host of reasons. And were that to happen, opportunities would open. But there too, I don't think we would see that unfold to success in 2024. I see there's 2 minutes. Am I done, or should I make one more point?
Yeah, no, please, no, make
All
one
right.
more point.
Now this will surprise some of you, and this has a longer time horizon. There's a great deal of talk among people who are following Moscow's war crime-laden war on Ukraine about the eventual fracturing of Russia, detoothing of Russia after this war. Now, I am all for defeating the Russians soundly in this war. But I think that sort of talk is neither helpful nor ultimately realistic. But here's the opportunity, an opportunity which is real but not necessarily likely. It is quite possible that if Putin is trounced in Ukraine, which will happen if, again, American policy at least continues at its current level, but preferably gets tougher, that we might be able with Russia at the end of that war to do what we did with Japan and Germany at the end of World War II, something we manifestly failed to do at the end of the Cold War. What happened at the end of World War II was not just historic, but unprecedented. That bitter foes, existential foes, became friends, partners, and ultimately allies. I don't rule out such a development with Russia. And one reason why that might happen, which of course is not put in the category of opportunities, is that right now with Russia tied tightly to China, right, they're partners, Xi says they're going to do extraordinary things. Well, if that happens, we're all in trouble, by the way. Even now, Chinese academics, journalists, even a third secretary at their embassy in Islamabad talk about Vladivostok as a Chinese city. In other words, China has revisionist objectives vis-a-vis Russia. There are people in Moscow who understand that right now, but they can't say anything because Putin has this idée fixe about the nasty West and the United States in particular. But this is something which could lead to US-Russian cooperation. But since we're in the land of the possibilities with very bright colors, I also don't rule out, despite what I've just said, that a strong West with sound American leadership that defeats Russia and Ukraine might also give China reason to reconsider its wolf diplomacy, which it has been practicing for the last 10 years, to the dismay of all of its neighbors, if not the dismay of the Latin Americans or the Africans. But then they're not neighbors of the Chinese.
Well, it's hard. There you go. Here. It's hard to imagine that kind of transformation in Chinese diplomacy or U.S.-Russia relations, but that's precisely the point of what we're doing here, imagining things that we otherwise can't predict in the moment to be able to prepare for futures that are very unpredictable. So thank you all so much. That was a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. And we will reconvene in about 10 minutes at 2 p.m. We have another panel coming, a great session on the future of Europe, countering corruption and accelerating the Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine and Moldova. Please don't miss it. It'll be a fascinating conversation again. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion. Thank you to the panelists.